Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Pocket Lobbyist end of year AB Ledge Wrapped video. We are so excited to be here with you today. We're going to discuss a few different things today, so really excited to have everyone here. My name, for those of you who aren't aware, is Melissa Cowett. I'm the founder of Pocket Lobbyist. I've been involved in Canadian government relations and public affairs for almost my entire career, the past 15 years. And we started Pocket Lobbyist about 3 years ago to create a platform that really empowers and allows every individual to have access to the kinds of government relations and public policy tools that I know every business and organization depends on to anticipate, interpret, and mitigate political risk, which is a way of fulfilling your organizational mandate. So we're really excited to be here today. Our goal today is to give you a bit of an overview on a few different topics. But before we get into talking about the agenda, I want to open up today's discussion by saying I hope that by the end of today's webinar, I leave you with 3 things that you can agree with. First of all, that political risk is organizational risk, that things that are happening in politics matter to your organization and that you should be paying attention and have the tools that you need to succeed in this field. Second, that lobbying is a strategic practice. Oftentimes, lobbying is downgraded and dismissed as something that is not as strategic as, say, finance, marketing, or human resources within an organization. But we know that this is not the case and that being strategic with your lobbying activities can yield amazing results. And third, that organizations, whether you're a business, a nonprofit, an association, that businesses have agency in government relations and public policy, and that lobbying is a way to exercise that agency. So we'll leave you with those 3 things. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the major and main events from 2024 and what they mean for 2025 and into the future, both at the Alberta and Canada level. We'll talk a little bit about what lobbying is and why it's such a strategic and important practice. And we'll get into talking about a way that you can level up your skills in this area with our GR 101 cohort, which begins on January 9th of 2025. So let's dive right into it. So every year, we really like to do a collection of some of the major stories that have really shaped Canadian and international public policy and politics, because we know that political risk is business risk. The things that have happened in politics throughout the last year are relevant to you and your business. And so we'd like to wrap some of the important events. Of course, it was a busy year and we won't be able to get to everything, but we'd like to highlight some of the major events that have really shaped Canadian politics and are something that you may consider moving forward in 2025 and beyond. This year was not only a huge political year for Canadian public policy and politics, but also internationally. There were over 80 elections that happened around the world in 2024. We have seen significant shifts from the election in the US to the UK and elsewhere. And we see that the world is changing. And just like with any other area, whether it's technology or marketing trends or global finance, we must respond to those changes as business owners and as people leading organizations. And so that's why we're going to look back so that we have a good idea of what we need to expect looking forward. So we've highlighted some of the major events that have happened in 2024. On the left-hand side, you'll see some events that happened sort of nationally, and then on the right-hand side, events that were more local to Alberta. We saw a lot of different changes this year. So Notley stepped down as NDP leader in early 2024. We had a government budget tabled in Alberta as well as federally. We went through a lot of different pieces of legislation that are impacting municipal affairs, electricity, healthcare, and so much more. When we get into the early stages of the summer, we see a new NDP leader elected in Alberta, which has really shifted the way that we're seeing politics. When we get into the second half of the year, the fall really began on a federal note with the ending of the supply and confidence agreement between the federal NDP and the federal Liberals. If the Liberals federally weren't already in a tenuous spot, that really did open up the door in theory for greater vulnerability, though we know that that hasn't actually materialized into a falling of the government and an election before the scheduled October 20th, 2025 date. So as things are happening politically, federally, we also had a lot of drama happening in Alberta provincially. Danielle Smith was able to come out of her really highly anticipated leadership review with more than 90% support. She does continue to poll higher than Naheed Nenshi, the new leader of the NDP, and we'll see what that actually all means when the sort of first test of the new NDP-UCP face-off happens in the Lethbridge West by-election on December 18th. That is an interesting riding for this by-election to be happening in, because it is riding a constituency that is usually so close. Usually the winner is able to secure that seat with less than 1% of the vote. And we also just found out this morning that Rachel Notley will be stepping down in the new year, which means that we can also anticipate there will be a provincial by-election in Edmonton Strathcona a bit later on, probably 6 months into the year, which is the maximum time that Premier Smith has to call that by-election. So we also saw in the fall the US presidential election, which is having continued ripple effects provincially, nationally, and internationally. And Prime Minister Trudeau has been attempting to deal with that with President-elect Trump, though the ripple effects that we've seen are widespread, and President-elect Trump isn't even in office yet. We'll see that in mid-January. So again, a lot of big major political events and shifts that we read in the news and we see happening. But the important thing to note is that they do sort of cascade into many smaller events that are going to have a much more direct impact on your business and organization. If we can summarize the changes that we saw in 2024, I've summarized them sort of into 5 buckets. We saw leadership changes, policy changes, budget changes, election changes, as well as polling changes. And that is going to really impact the way that governments conduct themselves moving forward in 2025. And so let's just break down each of those categories without talking in too much detail about any one specific. When we look at the leadership changes that we saw in 2024, provincially in Alberta, we see the UCP leadership approval rating really sort of put to doubt the fact that Danielle Smith does not sort of have the confidence of her party with that more than 90% leadership election vote. We see as well that the polling externally, not even just internally by party members, but by all Albertans, does have the UCP leading on balance, though that's not true consistently all over the province. And it has only been a few months since Naheed Nenshi has become the leader of the NDP. And so we'll have to see what this new era holds for the NDP, the new dynamic. Once Nenshi is actually an MLA and sitting in the legislature, we might see a different shakeup of polling and dynamics, but time will really only tell for those aspects. So leadership has really been a key tenet of 2024, the sort of tone that comes from the top and the way that people understand what is happening through online or social media, or just the tone that's coming politically from the top. When we talk about leadership at the federal level, we do see that Trudeau's Liberals are, for now, his Liberals, but increasing calls for a change in leader federally, given the fact that the Liberals have been unable to pull ahead of the Conservatives for months now. The Conservatives have maintained, under the leadership of Pierre Poilievre, a more than 20-point consistent lead, and we are expecting there to be an election next year. We won't know exactly when, given the fact that it's a minority government status, but definitely the leadership of the Liberal Party and the Government of Canada is having an impact on the politics. You see things that are sort of stalled in Parliament, or were stalled in Parliament. You see difficulty building consensus on issues across Canada, but also within the Liberal caucus. And you also see the impact of Trump on the Trudeau Liberals in the leadership perspective as well, because Trump really does, whether this is objectively true or not, Trump really does not see Prime Minister Trudeau as an equal in the way that maybe other prime ministers and presidents may have interacted with one another. And so it really does put leadership in question in terms of 2025. How is the leadership dynamic between the prime minister and the provincial premiers going to impact policy? And how is this leadership dynamic between President-elect Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau going to impact Canadian public policy? And we've already seen some of what that could look like with respect to tariffs, with respect to sort of the negotiation. We have the CUSMA or USMCA, whichever you prefer, renegotiation in 2026, huge economic impacts for Canada. And this is all, largely due to leadership back and forth that we're seeing at that level. And you do see the kind of strength in polling numbers for the CPC under Pierre Poilievre, and you do see that the shift that the CPC is making and is sort of assumed in being a government in waiting. And so leadership really is impacting the tone and tenor of politics in Canada and Alberta, absolutely. When we look at policy, tone from the top, leadership always is a big component, but when we look at different policies that have changed a lot in the last year, we see provincially, certainly healthcare, with the healthcare refocus that the government of Alberta is advancing and has been advancing over the last couple of years. We see major changes in energy and environment, whether that's through electricity or through other ways with water. And we also see major changes to the municipal affairs level. So the introduction of political parties for Edmonton and Calgary in the upcoming municipal elections in Alberta, different funding models that have come through in 2024 and sort of change the dynamic. So you are seeing shifts in policy to really address some of the issues. Education could also be on there in terms of major investments that the province has made and the curriculum redesign that is currently underway. When you see the policy focus federally, you see a huge push for the sort of immigration approach that the federal government has already taken some action on, as well as just the growing concerns of affordability and cost of living that have definitely interrelations to immigration, just in terms of the increased load that nonprofits have and social service agencies, as well as government agencies, in serving a growing population. And so the sort of policy focus that we've seen from the federal government has tried to shift a bit more to these areas after public sort of discontent. But we've seen a lot when it comes to the energy and environment space. Definitely that affects Alberta with respect to the emissions cap and some other decisions that the federal government has made. And so again, 2024, an area that is characterized by sort of focusing on different policies that are either important to the electorate or important to the government. And as we'll talk more further on in today's discussion, there is a balance that needs to be had between both of those things. When we look at budgets are going to become, I think, an increasing issue when it comes to 2025 and beyond. When we look at 2024, we see the provincial government in Alberta taking huge leaps to try to eliminate the debt that Alberta has incurred, the sort of continuing to oblige by not having deficits, which is a legislated requirement in Alberta, and the idea of trying to address cost of living, but not necessarily bringing forth some of the tax breaks that were promised through the 2023 campaign yet. And so we see that the province in Alberta, to sum it up, is focused on very, very heavily on debt repayment and continuing to invest in the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund and sort of building a future for the province. That does mean that there have been spending increases that are maybe not commensurate exactly to population growth and inflation. But again, the focus being fiscal restraint in Alberta is going to continue into 2025 and beyond. We don't have a change in government in Alberta, or an opportunity for a change in government rather, until 2027. And so that is what you can expect provincially from a budgetary perspective. Federally, though, what we saw in 2024 is almost certainly not what we're going to see in 2025, given the fact that we are likely to see a change in government in 2025, whether that's earlier in the year, as the budget is a matter of confidence, or on the scheduled date of October 20th of 2025. Budget in Canada is in a much different situation than provincial budgets are in Alberta. the government of Canada is carrying a significant amount of debt. That amount is over 2.2 trillion now by latest numbers, recent $21 billion in additional spending being added. We'll see what comes back from Minister Freeland's fiscal economic update in the next week or so, and we'll have a better sense of what's to come in spring from the federal budget. But again, the federal government's fiscal capacity in terms of being able to continue to increase spending without revenues increasing, whether through increases in tax revenue or increases in productivity, which means, per capita GDP growing, has been a continued challenge. And we are seeing that have impact, or have seen that in 2024 and previously have an impact on interest rates and inflation. While interest rates have gone down, we saw another 50 basis points cut yesterday, and inflation is not increasing at the same rate. Those price levels have remained high, and cost of living has also remained high. And so you see the federal government in 2024 and posturing for 2025 through their commitments to cut the GST on certain items, as well as provide certain tax breaks. You see this as a government trying to address affordability concerns by increasing spending, when that may in fact be making the situation worse, and only time will tell. When we see an election in 2024, we're very likely to see a significant change in policy from the CPC and Poilievre, with significant fiscal restraint. So what to expect in 2025 is not the same level of spending on public services or tax credits or anything that we've seen under the previous Liberal government. We will see a significant reshift. That does not mean that we're going to see necessarily a government slash and burn, cut everything, but we are definitely not going to see the rates of increased spending, and we probably will see decreased spending. Time will tell, but that is really what we're anticipating there. When it comes to elections in the upcoming weeks and months, we have a by-election in Lethbridge West on December 18th in Alberta. Again, I mentioned earlier that this is a constituency that is typically so close that it'll be very interesting to see how that constituency goes. It's typically won with less than 1% of the vote, so very close riding. Since Premier Notley, or Leader Notley, former Premier Notley has stepped down, and Edmonton Strathcona will step down in the new year, we're going to see a by-election there as well. And we don't know whether this is a by-election that Naheed Nenshi will run in, or if somebody in Calgary will step down so that he can run. But suffice it to say, we're going to see probably at least 1 to 2 by-elections coming up in Alberta in 2025. We also have municipal elections across the province coming up on October 20th of 2025. On the Pocket Lobbyist platform for members, we are tracking and organizing all of the candidates and political party affiliations. So please do check that out if you are a member. But again, this is going to see some significant change likely at City Hall in Edmonton and Calgary, and perhaps across the province. And so we're looking at those elections as well, which will bring with them, less so from the by-election perspective, but definitely from the City Hall perspective, there will be a shift if there's a change in mayor and change in council with respect to whatever municipality that you're considering. And we do see changes to election rules and the introduction of, corporate donations municipally. And so these things are all going to impact sort of the propensity and the likelihood that certain people are able to be competitive in these races. When we look at the federal election, it is scheduled for October 20th of 2025, actually the same day as the municipal elections in Alberta. So hopefully for all of the people who are in government relations, that is not the case, because that would be a very busy evening. But again, we are likely to see a federal election at some point in 2025, and likely not as late as the scheduled date of October 20th. The next sort of major confidence in supply issue that we would probably see a vote on that is sort of less secure would be budget, when that's tabled in April, likely March, likely April. Again, we see it's unlikely that there'll be a federal election before that, based on how the Bloc Québécois and the NDP have acted and conducted themselves federally. They have sort of shown that, there's not a likelihood, at least on the NDP side, that they're going to contribute to the Liberal government falling before, at least that February, March timeline. So I would be watching for that spring timeline, and anything after that would probably at this point, as the current political dynamic stands, be borrowed time for the Liberals. We also see a significant sort of change in polling, maybe not over the short term, but over the long term. If I look back to what the polls were telling us in 2020 in terms of what the public wanted versus what the polls are telling us now, these things are quite different. So provincially, you see the UCP still being competitive with the NDP, and in many sort of instances that we've seen polling slightly ahead of the NDP, which is, contradictory to sometimes the public sentiment that you might hear. So again, the numbers don't lie, and we'll see how these change as Naheed Nenshi comes into his own as leader. But again, not necessarily shifting dramatically because of a leadership change or because of Danielle Smith's personal likability based on who you're talking to. But the thing that does matter a lot to Albertans as well as to Canadians is affordability and cost of living. And so you see this as the number one concern for individuals. And this breaks down to several different areas. So grocery prices, housing, cost of insurance, cost of living generally, the ability of wages not going up to the rate of inflation. All of these things are impacting polling, and they are, we see, making voters more inclined to support free enterprise, right of center, economic policy, political parties, which will benefit the UCP and likely benefit the CPC in the next federal election. Federally, we're also seeing the sort of dangers of this incumbent trap, meaning if you were the leader, during COVID, you're not likely to be a leader following COVID because of what we've seen actually globally with voters sort of rejecting the status quo and preferring the sort of more populist meat and potatoes, if you will, issues, as opposed to some of the other issues that were at the forefront during COVID. Not to say that one issue is better than the other, it's just voter preference. And if you have to rank those issues, voters are telling us and telling pollsters that they rank issues of affordability and economics higher right now than they do those other things. So the reason why all of this matters is because political parties in 2025 and beyond are going to respond accordingly to what has happened in 2024 and what they're projecting in 2025. So if we wrap up all of these political events in a bow and ask ourselves, what actually can we take away from this? We know that voter intentions and desires are changing. Again, voters are asking their government to care in a sort of hierarchical way more about cost of living issues than they are social issues writ large. That's an oversimplification, but it is generally the trend that we're seeing. So we are seeing policy shifts from many different political leaders. You see NDP premiers in British Columbia, David Eby, changing their mind on the carbon tax, for example. Paradigm policy shifts that you see some leaders are making in response to what they have learned in 2024 and what they're anticipating in 2025. You also see a major shift in tone as well. So you see the sort of difference in tone from the leader that we see in Justin Trudeau in 2024 versus who we saw in 2025. There's a shift away from sort of hope and sort of optimism of all the art of the possible that you can do when you're just at the beginning towards the sort of reality that we find ourselves in. So we see that change in tone, and then we do see a reset of the status quo. The big thing is that voters want something different than they did 4 years ago, and political parties that are able to respond to and adapt to those changing circumstances are going to be the political parties that are successful. And so too does that apply to organizations that are able to reflect those same principles in their lobbying and government relations work. So when we look at all of the things that have happened in 2024, I always like to show this chart. Again, we don't know, no individual, unless you're working within government, knows what's going to happen. There's an old adage in politics that those who talk don't know, and those who know don't talk. So it's actually impossible to have a perfectly curated projection of what we're going to expect to see, but there are things that we do see, and there is evidence that we can draw on from 2024 and combine this with what we know about political systems and what we know about the political nature of the systems that we're working in. And so if you can do that, there is an opportunity to be pragmatic and get ahead of political risk in your organization. And we want to empower you to be able to do that, which is why Pocket Lobbyist exists and why we're so excited to talk to you today about the importance of lobbying. So for those of you who don't know what lobbying is, if you're watching this, you likely are a lobbyist and maybe don't even know it. Lobbying is about communicating with a public office holder in an attempt to influence. So asking basically for anything from a public office holder. So if you're a business and you've ever talked to government about anything, asking them to change something, you're a lobbyist. You may or may not have the same sort of registration obligations, but you're a lobbyist. You are communicating with a public office holder in an attempt to influence, and therefore you fall into that definition. And why is that something that I am so passionate about people realizing? Because it takes away the sort of illusion that lobbyists or lobbying is some abstract action that only people who have really close connections with government or are shady or any other words you want to call them have access to. When we are pragmatic, when we think about any business relationship and any interpersonal relationship, we have to be realistic with what we are talking about. And I love this quote from James Madison: "The essence of government is power, and power, lodged as it must be in human hands, will ever be liable to abuse." So of course, there are instances where lobbying results in nefarious behavior, but it doesn't have to be that way. And that's not the standard or the sort of expectation that most lobbyists and people who are engaged in this work have when they're dealing with government. Lobbying has existed for so long and has been something that humans do as long as we've organized. We look back to the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans, and even though it didn't look like it does today, there was lobbying in that time period. As I said, wherever power exists, the desire to influence will exist. And so when government has power to change something, there is going to be a desire on the part of the people who are impacted by that power to advance their interests. And that is perfectly fine if done ethically and within the confines of the law. We see the sort of historical sort of mentions of lobbying in Great Britain, where people would gather in the lobby outside of Parliament to sort of influence other members of Parliament that maybe had more power. We see it in the United States when President Ulysses S. Grant would sit in the lobby of the Willard Hotel and business people would come up to him and try to talk to him about policy. And so that's really where the word comes from, whether you want to use the Great Britain or United States definition. Again, it's communicating and interfacing back and forth, which is a very normal and expected action that business owners that are impacted by government policy should be doing. Now, you may have seen in the news some suggestions to fire your lobbyist. I actually always love to bring this up. This is Pierre Poilievre, who wrote an op-ed talking about how companies should fire their lobbyists, because CEOs typically don't notice what their lobbyist is doing because they don't understand politics. And so the problem that I see from this is that not that people have lobbyists or are lobbying, it's that they don't have a fundamental understanding of what is involved in the act of lobbying. So going to the people and really understanding what people want is part of it. Governments get annoyed with lobbyists, and lobbyists have a bad reputation because of the perception that a lobbyist has not sought to get the perspective and the best interest of the voter before going to government. And so the reason why there's this anti-lobbyist rhetoric is because organizations maybe sometimes position themselves only from what they believe is in their best interest without considering the public. But I have news for you. If you are able to listen to voters, government still wants to hear from you. So lobbying is should not be dismissed just because it has a negative reputation in some confines. It should just be altered and changed to ensure that you're aligned with both government expectations as well as public expectations. If you are an organization that is acting and advocating on behalf of the good of voters, go to those voters to get their support for your policy issue. So lobbying doesn't have to be a bad thing. When you look at what the government wants and what you want, you can lobby about things where there's mutual interest and find common ground. And that's really all lobbying is about. So in the final couple minutes of this webinar, I want to just share with you a solution that we have to dealing with the complexities of this challenge. If you are having issues sort of accepting the problem or struggling to understand why lobbying is important, maybe it confuses you or seems shady or futile or irrelevant, let us know and we'd be happy to chat with you about all of the successes that we've seen from people who have engaged in this behavior in a meaningful way. But if you are convinced that lobbying isn't something that you should shy away from, maybe your next question is, I'm not exactly sure how to deal with lobbying or the issue. And in comes the common fixes that you can engage in. You can add responsibility of lobbying to your existing staff or existing personnel. You can hire somebody for that role, or you can contract a lobbyist externally. And these are typical fixes that people go to when they think that they need a lobbyist. Some of the barriers, though, of those solutions are that lobbying, despite sometimes the public perception about it, is a highly specialized skill set and therefore is not something that is easily found in the marketplace. It is very niche kind of expertise and skill set. And so finding that skill set is often difficult. There's often capacity issues too. Adding the sort of responsibilities of a portfolio of lobbying onto an existing person in your organization may be overwhelming and unrealistic to do a good job with it. And there's also the cost element of it. You are going to be paying at least $85,000 a year for somebody who can lobby for your organization, and that's a junior level. These types of roles can be very, very highly paid because they're very, very impactful when it comes to anticipating and interpreting and mitigating political risks. If you want to hire a consultant, on the lower end of cost of consultants is that $5,000 a month range for a lobbyist consultant. So again, there are barriers to addressing these issues, but we have a new solution and something that we've been working on for the last couple of years, which is our GR 101 cohort offering. So you can decide to do any number of things if you're looking to anticipate, interpret, and mitigate political risk. You can do nothing, which is probably going to cost you the most because you're leaving a lot to chance. You can hire, which could cost you about $85,000 a year or more. You could contract, which will cost you at least $50,000 a year or more. Or you could sign up for our GR 101 cohort, which is a $2,500 fee for the cohort experience. It's an innovative professional development opportunity. It's affordable, accessible, and practical. And the next cohort begins on January 9th. We teach you everything that you need to know about understanding how government works and being strategic about being a lobbyist. It's all virtual instruction. You have forever access to live recordings and resources. We give you access to political insights and resources, and you have one-on-one opportunities for feedback on how to draft materials that are required to be a lobbyist, and as well networking opportunities with other people that are in the field. The ideal candidate for this opportunity is a private company or nonprofit organization, associations, consultants and advisors, or government officials. It's really anybody who wants to understand the strategy of how government works. It's nonpartisan, but it is political, and it'll help you develop the political antenna to really be good at this work and deliver results for your organization. There are 6 sessions that start from January 9th until February 13th. It's every Thursday at 2 p.m. Mountain Time for 2 hours virtually. So you can join from anywhere. And if you're unable to join a certain session, you can always watch those recordings after. The timing is also ideal because it is a slower part of the year. We are leading up to a year of political change with session and budgets and elections happening. And so being prepared with these skills is going to really help your organization moving forward. So we encourage you to consider joining us on January 9th for our 4th iteration of the cohort. It's $2,500 investment plus tax, and you can do so by scanning the QR code or going to pocketlobbyist.com/cohort. And if you sign up by midnight on December 13th, you can get 30% off using the code webinar. We want to make sure that everybody who wants to get these skills can access them. And if cost is a barrier for you, we highly recommend you take advantage of this opportunity. So again, That means that you're really saving thousands of dollars to accomplish a lot of the same goals that you would with a lot of the other options that you could have in terms of anticipating, interpreting, and mitigating political risk with lobbying. So we really encourage you take a look at this. So we hope by the end of this webinar that we've convinced you that political risk is organizational risk, that lobbying is strategic, and that you do have agency. And the way to exercise that agency is by equipping yourself with the skills and tools you need. And you'll be able to do that by joining us on January 9th with GR 101. Thank you so much for being here today. If you have any questions, please email us at hello@pocketlobbyist.com. And I'm really looking forward to those of you that we'll see in the new year. Happy holidays and happy new year to everybody who has joined us here today.